Across the edge of the world, how America was discovered. For centuries, Europe stared westward at an empty horizon. Maps faded into uncertainty long before reaching the Atlantic's far edge. Sea monsters curled in the margins. The ocean beyond familiar routes was imagined as endless, violent, and unknowable. Many believed that ships sailing too far would vanish into mist or plunge from the world itself. Yet curiosity kept pushing outward. Trade routes to Asia had become dangerous and expensive. The Ottoman Empire controlled overland passages. Spices, silk, and gold were worth fortunes, and kingdoms searched desperately for faster paths to the riches of the East. The sea, vast and terrifying, suddenly looked like opportunity. By the late 15th century, new technologies made such dreams plausible. Caravels, small, agile ships with advanced sails, could tack against the wind. Magnetic compasses guided sailors through fog and darkness. Astrolabes measured latitude by the stars. Cartographers stitched together knowledge gathered from generations of mariners. The Atlantic was no longer just a barrier, it was a challenge. A world ready to be crossed, southern Europe buzzed with ambition. Portugal explored Africa's coast, inching southward year by year. Spain, newly unified after centuries of conflict, hungered for prestige and wealth. Royal courts filled with proposals from navigators promising shortcuts to Asia. Among them stood a Genoese sailor convinced that Earth was smaller than most scholars believed. Based on miscalculations of distance and optimistic readings of ancient texts, he argued that Asia lay only a few weeks' sail westward. Oceans, he insisted, could be conquered by determination and mathematics. After years of rejection, Spanish monarchs finally agreed to fund the gamble. 3 ships were prepared. The Santa Maria, largest and slowest, carried most supplies. The Nina and the Pinta, lighter and faster caravels, would scout ahead. Crews gathered in coastal ports, a mix of seasoned sailors, adventurers, criminals offered reduced sentences, and men desperate for fortune. They stocked barrels with fresh water, salted meat, dried biscuits, wine, olive oil, and beans. Livestock was brought aboard. Weapons were cleaned. Religious symbols were nailed to masts. On an August morning in 1492, the small fleet slipped away from the harbour and into the Atlantic swell. Behind them lay Europe. Ahead lay nothing anyone in their world had ever seen. Into the open ocean. The ships followed familiar currents southward before turning west into waters rarely travelled by Europeans. At first, spirits were high, winds were favourable, the sea rolled gently beneath the hulls. Then weeks passed. Land vanished completely. The compass needle behaved strangely, drifting from the North Star's position. Floating weeds spread across the surface in endless mats. Birds appeared, then disappeared again, teasing hope. Food spoiled. Water grew foul. Wooden planks creaked endlessly. Men slept among ropes and barrels, soaked by salt spray and storms. Tempers flared. Fear crept in with every sunrise that revealed nothing but water. What if the ocean truly had no end? What if the winds that carried them west would never allow them to return? What if they had sailed beyond the known world? Yet the fleet continued. Currents pushed them forward. Discipline held, barely. Calculations were revised. Distances were underestimated to calm the crew. Then, after more than 2 months at sea, signs multiplied. Fresh branches floated by. Birds circled in greater numbers. The water smelled different. In the early hours of an October morning, land finally rose from the darkness. Low and green. Impossible. The ships anchored near sandy beaches fringed with palm trees. Clear water revealed coral beneath the hulls. Unknown birds flashed brilliant colors through the air. Europe had not reached Asia. It had reached an entirely different world, a continent already alive. The islands were not empty. People watched from the shoreline as strange wooden structures with white wings drifted toward them. Their villages stood among forests and lagoons. They traveled in canoes carved from tree trunks. They wore ornaments of gold, shell, and feathers. For Europeans, the sight was astonishing. For the islanders, it must have been equally bewildering. The newcomers explored beaches and inland paths, naming rivers, headlands, and settlements according to their saints and monarchs. Flags were planted, declarations were made to an audience that could not understand the words, but could certainly sense the gravity of the moment. Gold ornaments caught European eyes immediately. Where had they come from? Were these islands near a wealthy empire? Had Asia finally been reached after all? Believing they stood on the outskirts of the East, explorers called the inhabitants Indians, a name born from geographical error that would echo through centuries. They sailed onward through warm seas, discovering more islands, mapping coastlines, gathering fragments of information through gestures and observation. Everywhere they went, they found complex societies, farming communities, fishing villages, trade networks, traditions shaped by centuries of life in the Caribbean. One ship ran aground on a reef and splintered apart. Its timbers were repurposed to build a small fort, the first European structure in the New World. When the fleet eventually turned back toward Europe, two ships remained. They carried strange plants, unfamiliar animals, and stories that sounded like fantasy. Across thousands of kilometers of ocean, they raced toward courts that could scarcely imagine what awaited them. Shockwaves. Across Europe, news spread like wildfire. Land across the ocean, people, gold, potential routes to Asia, or something even greater. Maps were redrawn. Monarchs hurried to claim territories. Merchants dreamed of new markets. Priests saw souls to convert. Soldiers smelled conquest. Within years, new expeditions poured westward. Some hugged the Caribbean. Others pushed north and south along unfamiliar coastlines. One Italian navigator sailing for England charted shores far to the north, likely touching Newfoundland. Portuguese fleets explored Brazil. Spanish voyages reached the mainland of Central and South America. The outlines of two massive continents slowly emerged. Forests stretched endlessly. Rivers wider than anything in Europe cut through jungles. Mountains rose higher than the Alps. Cities of stone appeared inland, ruled by empires unknown to the Old World. Societies with roads, temples, astronomy, agriculture, and armies. It became impossible to maintain the illusion that Asia lay just offshore. This was something else entirely, a hemisphere that had never existed on European maps. Realizing what had been found over time, explorers and scholars began to grasp the truth. These lands were not the fringes of China or India. They were separate continents, vast beyond comprehension. Cartographers started drawing a new shape between Europe and Asia. A new name emerged, derived from another Italian navigator who described the coasts as part of New World, America. The word slowly took hold, and with it came consequences far greater than discovery alone. Plants crossed oceans for the first time in history. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco traveled east. Wheat, horses, cattle, sugarcane, and diseases traveled west. Populations collapsed in the Americas as epidemics swept through communities with no immunity. Empires rose and fell. Silver from mines flowed into Europe and Asia, reshaping global economies. Trade networks wrapped around the planet. The world became connected in a way it never had before. What began as a gamble by a handful of ships transformed human history. The meaning of the crossing. The discovery of America was not a single moment. It was a process, a collision of worlds, an unfolding revelation that stretched over decades, driven by ambition, misunderstanding, courage, greed, faith, and sheer accident. Sailors crossed oceans believing they would find Asia. Instead, they revealed continents already inhabited by millions. They triggered migrations, wars, cultural exchanges, and ecological revolutions that still shape the modern world. From the decks of wooden ships staring into endless water to the carving of new coastlines onto parchment maps, the story reads like a documentary filmed on the edge of the unknown. It is a tale of storms and stars, of currents and calculations, of fear held in check by hope, of humanity stepping beyond the limits of its own imagination and discovering that the planet was far larger, stranger, and more interconnected than anyone had ever dreamed. Across the edge of the world, history changed course, and nothing on Earth would ever be the same again.